Right, okay, if you're ready to start.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to today's Irish Studies seminar. We have, as usual, an audience here in the room and an audience joining us online through Teams. So if you are joining us online, just to let you know that we will be recording this seminar. So if you don't want to appear on the recording, turn your camera off.
Turn the camera off.
However, Fran, the camera will be on
If you give me a choice.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you don't have that option. So it's a great pleasure to welcome today Professor Adrian Frazier, who is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin and Professor Emeritus at the University of Galway. He's written widely on poetry and culture. He is the author of Behind the Scenes, Yeats, Horniman and the Abbey Theatre, 1990, George Moore, 1852 to 1933 in 2000, the Hollywood Irish, John Ford, the Abbey Actors and the Irish Revival in Hollywood in 2011, and John Behan, The Bull of Sheriff Street in 2013. And his most recent book, which we're celebrating this afternoon, is John Montague, A Poet's Life. Adrian knew John Montague for many years, and we're grateful that members of the Montague family have been able to come along this afternoon or are joining us online through Teams as well. So Adrian is joined today by Professor Fran Brearton, who is Professor of Poetry here in the School of Arts, English and Languages at Queen's. And the format of today's seminar will be a conversation between Fran and Adrian. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Fran, I think, to kick things off.
I think so. Can I just check where we are on time and questions at the end?
Yes, so there'll be time for questions. So we run for
we'll
about 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we'll move to Q&A.
Great, thank you. So I suppose I confess I have never written a biography. I think it's terrifying to have to do it. And I was really struck when I was reading this by something that Montague said in relation to Samuel Beckett's. The only good biography is an indiscreet one. Okay, so, and I'm sympathetic to that too. So maybe you could say something about discretion, indiscretion, and the writing process.
Yeah, I think it is frightening to write a biography about somebody, even if you don't know them. I mean, they're their literary remains, all that is left of them is kind of in your hands. You have to be just to them. You have to be fair to them. You have to be fair to the reader as well. But when it's a living person, I mean, a recently living person and somebody you knew, somebody who still has 3 widows surviving and 2 daughters and a lot of friends, it's very hard. I got some good advice from Richard Ryan, who was a poet and then later ambassador to the UN for Ireland and held other posts. A very good friend of John's, and he, at the end of, we spent like 4 afternoons talking, and at the end, as I was standing at his door leaving, he said, you know, I don't want to write your book for you, and it's your book to write, but I just want to tell you, you know, whatever you say, in this, whatever you discover and report, don't be worried about it. He said, we won't be surprised, his friends, and we still love him. And that was very freeing, you know, that they, you know, he was a scapegrace in their friend, and he got himself into a lot of scrapes and did things that he himself regretted and talked about in his work all the time. And so don't worry about having to tell the story of that. You know, you can't tell the story of his life without that. And we all know it, who knew him. So don't worry. And then I went on working for a while, and I had come up with, you know, some stories that were really frightened me. And they were, you know, I was troubled reading about them, and it was kind of, you suffer what he suffered, and what you suffer, what those around him suffered from him. You know, the whole thing is, you can't process that without experiencing it to some degree yourself. I said, you know, I'm talking to Peter Fallon, and I said, you know, I'm kind of worried about how to deal with this material. You know, like, I don't want to apologize. I don't want to cover up. I don't want to, where things are relevant to the poetry, I think I have to tell them. And I'm just, you know, I'm kind of frightened.
Mm.
And Peter's quoting Robert Lowell poem, said, why not just say what happened? And the that also.
Not that Robert Lowell was terribly, anyway. There's a way of shaping what happened, I suppose.
There is, and you can't get away from the fact that you're going to have to shape it. You know, there's like, people, when they review a biography, they tell the story that they've seen in the biography, and then, you know, at the end they say, well, you know, he did a good job reporting this, or he didn't do a good job reporting this, but actually you made it up out of the documents at your disposal. You decided on what was going to be foregrounded and what was going to be backgrounded, what was going to be left out, what went in. You know, how much close focus you were going to give to certain incidents as opposed to summary and that sort of thing. All that stuff are decisions you make page by page. And there, you could have done it 50 different ways. So yeah,
Is there anything you left out?
Geez, somebody I was contacted me over the weekend and said he was, you know, noticed something in this book, and he was writing an article about John Montague, and could I look up this document for him? And I had transcribed it, but this person wanted the original. And, you know, can I see it? And I'd taken a photograph of it, but I hadn't named each photograph. And I noticed, you know, I was only allowed to photograph after COVID. You know, they changed the practices, and they said, because people can't be here in the library all the time, you can use your camera and photo. I have 20,000 pages of archival material photographed. So you're going to leave out an awful lot of stuff. You know, there's just too much material. He was both a scriptophile who always, you know, was writing every day, wrote in his diary all the time, did tons of drafts. He saved everything, got it into archives. So there's a tremendous amount of material, and you leave stuff out that isn't relevant to understanding the person that wrote particular poems. This was my kind of principle. I mean, if it isn't, people are only reading about him because he wrote books, and they want the ideas that they'll understand those books better if they read this biography. So if it's not aiding in some way in that cause, then I don't put it in, or I put it in the background.
Yeah. But you know, I can see that principle at work all the way through. It's difficult when a poet is quite intensely autobiographical in certain ways as well, what is or isn't relevant. But I was conscious reading it of, there is a lot of hurt, and how difficult some of that is to negotiate. I mean, I suppose for me, things I had known that are always present when you're studying Montague or reading him or teaching him, things I didn't know at all that clearly reverberated in the work, but that work, some of it was not seen in his lifetime and that you've included here. So that's really, you know, how far that changes the perspective and how you felt about including some of that material as well. When I think, you know, and there's a point where you talk about, certainly from the breakup of the second marriage, some of the poems that come out of that he didn't put in print either here or in the States at the time. Wanted to, didn't want to, it's not quite.
No, he wanted to.
He wanted to.
He didn't want to right away, but I mean, there's a story, if you haven't read the biography yet, just to quickly describe what Fran's talking about, is his second wife was the daughter of an American GI who came ashore on D-Day in Normandy, and then made a relationship with her mother on V-Day. Like, it's a classic kind of tale of the time, but he suffered a very terrible post-traumatic stress syndrome, and when he would hear a loud noise, he would become violent. And children make loud noises all the time, you know. So he smacked his children, but he also, you know, there was that whole thing interfered with their development of their understanding of intimacy with men, and Evelyn started hitting him back, and they would fight with each other, and it became part of her being. And the trouble in her character was something that attracted him originally when she was a young woman, and he was wanting to find somebody with whom to have children. And he liked that. He thought he could help her with her trouble, but he also liked the volatility and even the violence within her. He found it exciting. But when they got further into their relationship, they wound up battering each other. And he didn't like that, you know. And when they'd had children and the children were seeing this, their parents are beating each other. Not all the time, but I mean, it happened. One daughter said she'd seen it, you know, 4 times, and another one said maybe more times than that. But each time was devastating for John, and he realized, actually, I can't be here. You know, I can't be in this. I can't continue this. And he fled from it. But when he was writing about it, when it happened, he had to write about he not only was somebody who, everybody's hurt a lot, you know, everybody hurts according to the famous song, but he wrote about he thought the point where you hurt is what you have to examine in your writing. You know, you have to get at that point that's hurting, and you have to illuminate it and enable other people to experience it, and that will be helpful to them. You know, was his notion of art. So anyway, he wrote these poems, and they're wrecking to read, really. I mean, they're terrifying poems, and there's no transcendence in them, really. They're traces of a disaster in a marriage, and and he put them away, and then after the marriage broke up, he felt, I have to get these into print before I can write what happens next. He had a whole sense of his life of, my collected poems are to be chapters in my life. And until this chapter is actually done, I can't write the next chapter, you know. When he was told by his publishers, you can't print these in Ireland, you'll be destroyed, you know, I'll be destroyed. the publisher, will be destroyed. We can't print these poems. They're very good poems. They're just, and the American publisher said, they're great poems, John, but, you have to wait until for many years before you can publish these poems. Well, he didn't have many years to wait. He was already an old man then.
Yeah.
And he couldn't go on. He said, okay, writing poems as I write poems, if that hurts other people, I'm not going to write any more poems. I'm stopping.
Yeah.
If the intimacy of my work is unbearable to people and actually hurts them, when I was originally undertook this whole path in life, I thought I was being helpful to people. I was revealing my life to them. And if it's hurting other people, I won't do it anymore. And so he started translating.
Yeah.
I mean, it killed him.
Yeah.
Basically.
See, for me, that was the great unknown of the story.
Unbelievable.
That retrospectively clarifies something, if you know the collections from beginning to end, about what changed and why, or what didn't continue to happen.
Yeah, I remember I wrote reviews of those later collections, and I was going through them, like, this is like stuff, from the 70s. This is like something, what is going on here? And I said, but this one is great. This is like a real 1980s poem, and it turned out they were assembled. The later collections were assembled out of things that he had written in his notebooks many years earlier. Like, he had to continue to publish collections or he couldn't live. He couldn't be, he couldn't be Ireland professor of poetry. He couldn't have readings. He couldn't go to workshops. He couldn't, he needed to continue to bring out poems. He wasn't a professor or something like that. So he did translations and these assemblies of really what was work that didn't make the cut earlier.
Yeah, I was thinking, we'll come on to Robert Graves maybe a little bit later if there's time.
Mm-hmm.
But I was struck as well. Graves always said that the poetry is part of the poet. It's the poet's spiritual autobiography. You can rewrite it and reshape it any way you like, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see that telling one's spiritual autobiography through the poetry brings that risk with it. But I was also really the big surprise for me, because I've looked at a lot of poetry manuscripts and how people write and what they do and how they do it. He really researched these. I've never, you can say more about it, but the way he sat down to write poems and potentially took years over them. And actually, like Graves, this idea that you have 2 or 3 books on the go at any one time. So it's really knocked my sense of where things fall in that way, to learn that some of the later work, as I thought, is actually from the 70s and 80s, that the books as they're coming out are gestating kind of at the same time. And maybe you could talk just a little bit more about how he operated. I've not seen his manuscripts, but that you mentioned somewhere that he has notes on what he's thinking about, what's influencing him. There's a degree of scholarly consciousness about the process, which I think strikes me as quite unusual. Would that be fair?
Well, the deliberateness and the survival into poetry writing of compositional practices he was taught when he went to St. Patrick's in Armagh and UCD, of outlines, of preparing materials, of finding models, of writing commentaries on your drafts, in which you act like you're another person and you critique your drafts, and then putting them away and coming back. Like a poem of his will be written with, if you look at a draft, there's like 6 different writing instruments used on the page. And because of when he grew up, the 1930s, he would never use another piece of paper. He'd take a piece of paper, like he'd take Fran's notes there, and he'd start writing the poem on the back of it, and he would just keep using that piece of paper for 10 or 15 years before he decided, okay, this is going to the typewriter. It's just, this is not there yet. And sometimes he would think, I needed other kinds of experience before I can finish this poem. I'm not yet the person that can finish this poem. Like there are things when you look at them on the page, as you said, they come off like this is somebody's just thinking in a moment. This is a moment's meditation by somebody in a certain life situation. But they're in fact the products of amazing preparation, deliberation, comparison with analog text by other people that are doing something similar. It's
and we probably have a bit of a belief in the spontaneity of lyric utterance.
Well,
there's
a spontaneous trace in the notebook of where it began, but that's a long way from where it ended.
Yeah. So the big surprise to me was that all legendary obstacles, which of course is beautiful, it is lyric perfection on the page. 10 years.
Yeah.
I was quite taken aback by that, in it, that he wasn't. There are some other poets, Heaney or Longley, who would say sometimes the poems just come in a kind of happy trance. They almost just walk down the page. Not always, but sometimes. And it didn't seem as if he ever wrote like that, but the end product looked like that.
Yeah.
The art that conceals the kind of labor behind it, which really, gave me to think about a kind of work ethic I hadn't seen, I suppose. Is that part of am I a poet, am I a critic, am I both? Or where he sits on that boundary?
He's a more scholarly creature than a lot of poets. Like he really is very aware of the whole of English literature and French literature, and he constantly trying to keep up with all of his contemporaries, and aware of need to change who he is as a poet. Myself I must remake was his favorite line from Yeats. Myself I must remake. Is that once you have finished one book, you need to become a different person for the next book. You can't just do it over again.
There's a canny sort of planning that goes on as well, which is really, there's a point where he quote notes he's made to himself, and it's write stories as good as Hemingway's or maybe better than Hemingway. Lowell can be equaled, and I think the invisible bit is possibly surpassed as well behind that, to clearly set out ambition in certain ways. Does that not set you up also for disappointment, though?
Probably. He's only, I think he was like 24 when, I can't imagine at 24 the preposterous pretension of sitting down and saying, Adrian Frazier writes this, James Joyce can be equaled. Like, no, not by me.
Yeah.
He had big aspirations. And he was never content with, he didn't overestimate really the level of achievement that he had acquired at different points in his life. He always thought, the next one is going to be better.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that he was deluded that he was already doing as well as Lowell.
And it doesn't, and I'm all in favor of, set the I think Edna Longley once talking about that kind of arrogance that you get in someone like Yeats, says, but Yeats's poetry only asserts what all poets must assume. Otherwise, why would you so much as put pen to page?
Yeah.
In a way that you have to be able to bring something more, something better, something different.
Yeah.
And that feeling is there. But I'm interested in what you say about the awareness of contemporaries, because like anybody, I read this, I'm sorry, I read it partly for the literary gossip. And I think anybody would be fibbing if they said they weren't interested in that. And I was at all the wrong conferences, clearly, at a certain point, missed loads of it. But that awareness of contemporaries as both a kind of blessing and a curse, hugely important to the sense of a movement. Maybe you might talk a little bit about that, what he called, I think, the Second Irish Revival, and how it somehow got pushed into the sidelines by what happened up here.
Yeah.
I don't want to make this an up here, down there argument, but
no, but people did have that for a long time. But
yeah.
there were people up here that were at one point down there. Michael and Edna, for instance, Derek Mann. There were a few others at Trinity in the 60s.
Yeah.
And they happily participating in the literary life of Dublin during the time. And starting magazines in Dublin and that sort of thing. Atlantis was in, like, Derek Mann and Seamus Dean started a magazine together. This is before, the Troubles and stuff, called Atlantis, between Trinity and UCD. That was that period. Montague was, and his publisher, Liam Miller, were calling the Second Irish Renaissance, Second Irish Revival. And there were a lot of poets suddenly coming out, and there'd be they had the Lantern Theatre on Marion Square. They were holding readings there. They're filling up with people. Like, they'd get a big show of people at various readings, either at UCD or Trinity or the Lantern Theatre or in a hotel or something like that. It was really popping. And then the trouble sort of begins, but also Michael and Edna left.
Yeah.
And Edna started doing work at Queen's. Michael got the job running the Arts Council in Belfast.
Well, the literature program, not the Arts Council itself, but yes.
The literature program. But he had a little bit of money, and most people didn't have any money. So having a little bit of money, we can put on a Belfast festival, put out cheap little pamphlets. Those were important to people.
Yeah. If anybody's got any of those in the attic, by the way, they're not cheap little pamphlets anymore. Never know.
And Montague was writing to to Liam Miller and saying, if we don't watch out, this whole thing is going to break up into two parts: a Belfast part and a Dublin part, and they're going to ruin each other.
Yeah.
And then a year later, this Belfast thing is completely taken off, and basically we're going to have to go to Belfast for the next Belfast festival. The Kinsella and Montague are going to go up to Belfast. And it all shifted very rapidly. And some of it had to do with the movement of key personalities, like Michael and Edna were important figures. Way more, I think, than Philip Hobsbawm, though a lot of people talk about it. But Michael and Edna had key roles in both the Arts Council and Queen's in organizing other activities and relating to people. And the Dublin thing just kind of disappeared. Like, it was really rolling for maybe 6 years, 7 years. A lot of people involved in it, like McGahern and Aidan Higgins, Richard Murphy, Thomas Kinsella, Montague. And for a while, associated with that would be Michael Longley and Derek Mann, etc., participating in all the same events, and then it kind of split, and things got reoriented towards the north, towards Belfast. And some of that had to do with the Troubles, of course. This is suddenly everybody is looking towards writers to the north about what is it? Tell us what's happening, like look into their poetry and you'll be able to understand this crazy place, that is suddenly in the headlines everywhere. And they got a lot of attention.
Oh yeah.
The British publishers moved in and scooped up Seamus and Derek and
I noticed
Michael.
in this though, and I'd always been aware and conscious of Montague's anxiety about relationship to Heaney. Mm-hmm. What I didn't realize is how alert he was to that very early on, almost before the kind of media circus begins around the north. There's a bit where you quote him saying, "We must try and enlist this cult," that's Heaney, before we have a rival Renaissance going full blast in Belfast. You can see the risk for this. The imagery is kind of interesting, as if he needs a headstrong cult, not quite tamed yet, needs to be enlisted, and I suppose
he hadn't published a book yet.
No, but
but he could see,
he could see it coming. Yes,
he's in his archive. There's every one of those poems published in various magazines, because Montague was publishing in the same ones, a lot of them south of the border. Montague cut out, and then he writes commentary. Like his school teacher, he grades the poem, and he crosses out words and says, "No, this is pretentious," and like he's marking the poem, and he's in one case he said, "Jeez, this is like W.R. Rogers, but way better, way better." Like he spotted him early on. Not that it was desperately hard to spot, but he met somebody was talking about, this was where Mary O'Malley's Lyric Theatre was. Somebody in the room here, but we were just this afternoon, but anyway, he was at Mary O'Malley's when he first met Heaney, and he said, I send your poems to Liam Miller and they'll be in Dolman Press. We'll publish them in Dolman Press. I'm the literary advisor to Dolman Press. And Heaney said, okay. And then Miller, who's had a drinking problem, didn't reply. He just, lost it.
Yeah. That returned,
That made a difference.
I mean, the interesting dynamic about audience relations here being where you are published and who, and the question that there's always been asked about, why, well, it was the title of an article, wasn't it? Why Seamus Heaney is number one. And there are a number of kind of factors playing into that, but one of them is your reach, and where you're in print, what the distribution is. I mean, I know there are other things too, but it's there all the way through. That particular rivalry, would that be fair, is a thread right through the rest of his life, as far as I can see.
They're very, it's a very intense relationship between them. And they, and Seamus didn't, John was aggrieved that Seamus never acknowledged that Montague was a forerunner. Why you would want to be known as a forerunner, I don't know. But he was aggrieved that Seamus didn't say, actually, I borrowed the stanza form for midterm break from the water carrier, or but Seamus did. John was a forerunner for him. Seamus started writing in sequences. Seamus started trying to do a long poem. He rewrote the water carrier about 5 different times. he did feast upon the example of John, and he did it so easily and ably. It was in these, those poems, each one of them cost John so much, and Seamus would spin them off so quickly. It was, he felt he was blighting his own existence, basically. But eventually they through, a lot of hard conversations with each other, Seamus understood, and he started sending him the poems as soon as he'd write them, and say, look at this one, it's just like yours,
Which that makes it any better. But, yeah. But then there's something in that's, there are a lot of other influences there as well. Yeah. And I ended up with a slight sense that John Montague was seeing this somewhat out of proportion relative to other influences at the time. Perhaps that's on...
Seamus did the same thing with so many other people, Hughes and Frost and
Kavanagh,
yeah, like
you soak it up like a sponge,
But he did eat John's lunch, basically. John felt like he's whenever there's a competition, Seamus wins the prize.
Yeah,
and that's that annoyed Derek. It annoyed Michael Longley. I've heard each one of them personally to me give out about it. It just drive him nuts. Like he's getting all of the attention. Always.
I'm sure that's right. You think how early it is that he's photographed Heaney outside the front quad here with 1965, 66. It's, almost that kind of rock star status, and it comes really early. So I agree with you. All the others kind of gave off about it, but they did it a bit more discreetly.
Yeah, John didn't do it like a gentleman.
No,
he didn't. He agonized painfully in public to people that were almost next to strangers. Like, just be quiet about it. Like suffer in silence, man. But he couldn't.
Yeah. No, I understand it, and I can see this point in this where you list the Poetry Book Society choices, recommendations, and something is awry. Something is skewed in the way in which Montague is treated by the English literary establishment. I think that's absolutely
John
clear.
had kind of the opposite. Like if Seamus had plumas that just like to a level that nobody else in the whole world ever had, like just so much grace and friendliness and comradeliness and good manners, and made everybody feel good about themselves. And he was like just a natural born president or something. John was, he liked he was edgy and wanted to needle and irritate and put you in awkward positions and stuff like that. That was his gift, and it isn't a gift that gets you prizes,
No. Yeah, not necessarily friends far and wide. I can see, there's a lot of falling out, but then the story of Irish poetry and friendship is a complicated one at the best of times. I suppose the other thing that I think has been neglected about an understanding of Montague that this really brings out is how far Irish and American poetry are intertwined, how far influence is working and how it's working, because that's not really, it's understood a little better, I think, here, where people like Lowell, their work was introduced to Heaney and so forth, and the book's not readily available. Frost is somebody that he began to know as an undergraduate. There isn't much sense of American poetry and its impact in Ireland prior to that, but it's clearly there and kind of unsung until you told that story a little bit, and I struck by books that were impossible to find here that weren't in print. I mean, I know it's hard to imagine a world where you couldn't buy Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell, but there it was, or Robert Duncan and various others. And I wondered where you would kind of rate his significance in terms of keeping a dialogue between those two traditions, is the wrong word, but see what I'm getting at, how much he's bringing influence here or learning from it, or...
I've heard from a number of poets of the next generation that, yeah, they became acquainted with American ways of writing poetry through Montague. Is it part not just through reading his work? Because John's actually way more formal than a lot of sort of West Coast poets, or but he would have talked to them about them with respect. You know, like what is like how do you, like Robert Creeley, you can read a few poems by Robert Creeley, and there's, you know, there might be one word in a line, 2 words in the next, 3 words in the next, 4 words, then the poem's gone. You know, that's the poem. And you look at it, is there anything there? You know, and then you read another one, then another one, and then you realize, geez, this is kind of interesting. You know, and then you read another one, just, oh, that's a great one. You know, like he is doing something that is new and highly intelligent, and that we haven't heard before, and it takes a while to see what it is. And the John was acquainted with those. He had not only had those books, but he shared them with other people and would like to, you know, talk about poetry with other poets. So in that way, I think he did.
Yeah. He's in, I saw it more. I know there's work on Heaney and American poetry. It occurred to me the book is better, the Montague and American poetry and style is underexplored, just in case anybody's listening and he's looking for a topic. In terms of his forms, I agree that, but I can now see probably more things in some of these poems in relation to the American writers he was engaging with.
He had a very long friendship with a guy who was his, when he went to Berkeley from Iowa Writers Institute, that'd be like 1956. So he'd been 28 or something, 28 years old when he went there. And he had this teacher named Thomas Parkinson, who was a Yeats scholar, but he was also a poet in San Francisco, and he wrote the first book about the beat poets in America. And he regarded himself as one of them. They regarded him as an academic, really. But he and John had a correspondence after John came back to Ireland, and then continued after he moved to France. And the correspondence was a lot about what is Gary Snyder writing? What is what are the San Francisco poets doing? And then John would send them his work. And at some point, John was writing, the kind of standard line in Irish poetry would have been a pentameter line, 10 syllables, basically. And they would have normally been shaped into stanzas, grouped, and often rhymed as well in that period. And John sent him a few poems that had very short lines, and they were not exactly equal in terms of number of syllables or even of accents. And Parkinson wrote back and said, "This is better for you. You're better at this. You should stick. The short lines are working for you." And that is a major change for him. Is when he stops writing pentameter poetry and starts writing in short lines and finding ways to group them. And discovering to what degree do I want to keep the lines of an equal length, or group them in stanzas, and there's a huge area of experimentation there. But it's with the encouragement of somebody who is situated within West Coast poetry.
Yeah.
And is basically saying, this is a release for you, really. Is you're getting all snarled up trying to write kind of more like Robert Lowell or Yeats or something like that, dense poetry, when actually you should go for plain words, lucidity, and short lines.
Yeah.
And when Heaney goes to, at one point, Montague went back to San Francisco, and he was kind of not writer in residence, but he was one of the poets on the staff. He was teaching a couple courses for one semester a year. He did it 2 years in a row, and then the third year he pulled out, and the Parkinson, who was running that program, said, "Okay, I'll bring Heaney." And you'll notice that Heaney, when he is in San Francisco, he thinks they're a bunch of savages, really, these West Coast poets. But he starts writing in short lines.
Yeah.
And he starts working in these little stanzas, little 4-line stanzas.
Yeah, it's wintering out.
It's wintering out.
North, yeah.
It's a total break.
And some of the early North as well.
Total break.
Which then makes me think, is that change in form for Montague? Now for Heaney, it's so obviously bound up with trying to find an adequate form in relation to a felt responsibility to the Troubles as well. Is that true for Montague? Is that looking for a form to accommodate what was happening in the North? He doesn't seem to me.
John was doing it before the North.
Is before,
But
just in the way that when you get something like the rough field and its collage effect and the little skinny lines and the columns and that's being, I've always felt put together as a completeness out of.
I think the later sections of the rough field, he is definitely, when he's writing those, trying to find a form to deal with a world of fracture.
Yeah.
He wants to actually replicate fracture and conflict and brokenness on the page, and almost literalize it, and chaotic things in conflict with each other. But those sections were written kind of post 1970, I think.
Yeah. There's some of the last ones to go in it. Yeah. No, I wondered the preoccupation with responsibility. And I don't find that he talks about the Troubles in quite the same way as we begin to see as almost the paradigm of how one talks about it, which is how Heaney talked about it, and the dominance of that. I think what is a felt responsibility is very different for different poets. I'm curious as to where he felt an obligation to do or say something, and how far that extended.
I think he, from 68, when he came home back to Fintona, basically to see his mother, and to talk with his brother, who Andrew Turlock's father was, who were sitting in the back row there. He represented civil rights people in court, and also people who were seeking, to rent housing, Catholic people trying to rent housing when they were being excluded. He represented them as well. He became acquainted with first the causes of civil rights marches, but then also became acquainted with the emergence of violence within his hometown, and he was torn up by it. And he felt like, I can't stay in Paris. I want to leave Paris and go back and live in Ireland. I've got to get closer to this, and I need to speak for people in my community. I think he felt I have an obligation to do what I can. And I'm in a community that has both Protestants and Catholics in it, but I'm also from a Catholic family that has a certain history, and I want to tell what their history is up to this point in this place. Because I think my family is caught up in this, what's happening. I'm part of it. And my job as a writer is to address that directly. And if he had been, as some other people living here, the situation is kind of different in that you're nervous about your relationships with people around you, and you want to keep things somewhat going forward on a livable way. You aren't coming in from outside and then feeling like I must act now and speak out. That's very rocking the boat kind of behavior, and it's not particularly nuanced. And I think his approach to things seemed to Seamus found it threatening. What John was doing is like, it's and John would have been pressing Seamus to do more, to address things in the same way. And Seamus was just, I can't. That's not how I work, and I would be wrong for me. And that they was placed severe demands on people.
Yeah. Well, I wanted in that. I'm conscious of time here, but just as a last, because I'm going to get Robert Graves in here if it kills me. But the idea, in a sense, of that urgency of response, feeling the need to say something, seems to sit slightly at odds with a poet who is instinctively a love poet, probably over-influenced by Graves in a bad way, although I think The White Goddess is a profoundly misunderstood book, but poets took from it certain things about how they would live their life. But living that life is actually at odds with the kind of political engagement that you then see in something like The Rough Field. So, two different impulses to me are at work there. One of them, yes, driven towards, I must say and do something, and the other very much following Graves, who says, I am no longer engaged with this, I'm ruled by the old agricultural cycle, calls himself the fox who has lost his brush, I'm no longer part of this conflicted everyday world. I've retreated into some other kind of place and time. And that impulse seems quite strong as well. Whether one can live one's life well as a muse poet is as questionable for Montague as it was for Robert Graves, maybe. But you feel free to.
But that's an interesting question. I mean, he wrote A Chosen Light. It's like, comes out in like 67 or something like that, and the book is conceived more or less as the title indicates, is that I'm deliberately shaping an aesthetic, and I'm declaring it in this book. This is both a way to live and a way to write poetry in a very focused and deliberate way. And that book is very much guided by the sensibility, I think, of his wife, Madeline. Very formal and gracious, but deliberate. And then he writes a book called Tides, in which he's swept away by his engagement with various women in his life, both old and young.
Yeah.
And he's caught up in them and experiencing the emotions of grief and passion and love that are inspired by his relationships with various women. And I think then he thinks I'm really being a Gravesian poet at this point. Like I'm opening myself up completely to the other, and I'm trying to live in relation to earthly motions and things like I think he thought that's what he was up to. and then the troubles in the north really just, and post 68 events just intrude upon his life. You know, I can't ignore this. You know, I would be, you know, it would be, there's some Sartrean, Jean-Paul Sartrean, I must engage with the world that presents itself to me.
Yeah. It's interesting. I am conscious that we should open up to questions if that's all right for me.
Let's just pause and thank Fran for leading the discussion at this point, and Adrian as well for responding, and then we'll open it up to.
Okay, yes.
So we have an audience online. If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand digitally, and then Becca will unmute you or allow you to pose your question. If you're in the room, also just raise your hand normally and ask the questions on your mind. Yeah.
Is it incumbent upon a poet to reflect on society they live in? And is it incumbent upon a poet to reflect the society they live in?
I'm a bit hard of hearing, so I'm going to come up with some.
Is it incumbent for a poet to reflect on the society they live in? And can that be a positive or negative thing for the poet and the society?
Is it incumbent upon a poet to reflect upon the society he's in, and can that be negative and positive for the poet and for the society? I don't think it's incumbent upon them, but I personally don't think it's incumbent upon them. I think it's hard to not reflect on the world around you to some degree. Can poets, in the way they write about things, have a negative effect on things?
Yes.
I guess they could. Yeah, they could a little bit. I mean, how many people read it? Kind of depends on how many people read it as to what the impact is going to be. Is it, by the same token, how therapeutic, how helpful, how life-enhancing can their work be? That depends also on whether people take it to heart, people give it attention. I think the capacity for poetry to do harm is, I'm trying to think of a poem that's done a lot of harm. Like Yeats wrote those poems for 3 marching songs for the Blue Shirts, but they never marched to them. And then he rewrote them to make it impossible for anybody to sing them, because he was aware that they were potentially, these could, cause trouble. But can you think of poems that caused harm?
I don't think you can no more make the argument they cause harm than you can make the case that they do good. I mean, they do, but not in ways that we can measure, and it's never been in a way we can measure. I was wondering about your initial, sorry, I know it's not really my seminar, is it really?
Please go ahead.
There's something Michael Longley says very early on, where he says the artist has a duty to respond to tragic events in his own community and somehow to endorse that response imaginatively, but he's not saying that you are in any way untrue to your imagination by doing that. I think it's that really delicate balance between, so that was what we were talking about at the end there, that sense for me of Montague being pulled in 2 directions, really, and writing in 2 quite different ways because of it, that comes from.
I was thinking more about, in some sense,
But Owen, yeah, we're going to get into a different.
First of all, a warning about war, what it is, and how horrific it is.
Yeah, well,
and yet we're still involved in war.
Yeah.
I mean, they're warning and said this is wrong. what we're doing in the trenches, this is horrendous. You've got to understand what it is that we've lived through,
Yeah.
what we've done, and please learn from it.
Yeah. Although, see, Wilfred Owen famously saying, all the poet can do today is warn. Above all, I am not concerned with poetry. If you actually dig a bit deeper, is as ambitious as anything that's ever apparent in the pages of this biography too. He's absolutely concerned primarily with poetry. Is it good for my poetry to go and fight in the war, or is it not? Will it make me a great poet? Will it make me a better poet? Not, is it the right thing for the war? Is it the right thing for me? Nobody really talks about Owen that way, but anyway, that's, sorry, on a tangent.
Other questions? Yes.
Would I do it with my Fran? Excuse me, do you mind repeating my question?
Yes, absolutely.
Walk down?
Yeah.
Having read the book, I was struck by the fact that he had sought, I suppose, the written word because of his stammer, as opposed to the spoken word, and lived his life really through writing. But what was paradoxical was that when he got into his 30s, he became very much an impresario, and became someone who had a great skill set beyond poetry. They're not really the skills of a poet, they're more of an organizer and a mover and shaker.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not when he developed that confidence, did he ever confide in you that perhaps he was in the wrong direction in his life, and that he could perhaps, that he developed that confidence earlier, perhaps pursue a professional life with his brothers? Or do you think that he was always born to be a poet, and that was what he was going to do, irrespective of the circumstances of his life?
That's a good question. It's somewhat metaphysical, though. His stammer was a performance anxiety. So if he was talking in a space like this, he'd be fine, right? Brilliant. If you said, okay, get up to the microphone and recite this poem, he might have an attack. It was performance related. He didn't stammer in conversation, hardly at all. Do you think he did?
No.
Andrew and Turla? No.
No, I don't think so.
And I think the Montague family, his sense of it, but they're a very proud and distinguished family. They may come from a small part of the country, but he was highly aware that he had an ancestor that was, president of Maynooth. He had an uncle that was a bishop. That his father was, a justice of the peace, as well as a businessman, and running post office and things. That we are a distinguished family, and on our mother's side and our father's side, on our mother's side, we played a distinguished role in the Anglo-Irish War and in the Civil War, and have suffered internship. You know that we are important, and that when he went to UCD after his brother, who was like a star student, is that I'm an important person, and I'm a little prince, really, and I expect myself to get straight A's, and I expect people to take me seriously. And I may go straight into a university, or I may go straight into a government service. Like he had you may think you're coming from Garvaghey, you're coming from Fintona, you're a bog trotter. But no, that family had a sense of, we are a distinguished, important people with a great history behind us. And and everything that he did in school, like he was a brilliant, the people in the family are very smart, obviously. I mean, they got high IQs. They do well on tests. Is that he's getting prizes and winning, academic contests all the time. He was confirmed in his belief that, I can do important things. And when people in that generation, and I think it was incredibly significant that the people rushed into Ireland post-war trying to figure out, where did Joyce and Yeats come from? What's it, these brilliant writers, and Beckett writing these unbelievable writers coming out of this tiny little country. And the other young people said, yeah, people like us, and I'm in the next generation. And and I think he listened to that and thought, it would be a very fine thing for me to be an author. It's not just, well, I'm conquering my stammer, but I'm, Lowell, he could be equaled, like they had outsized expectations of the wonder of being an author, a great author. Like, just as, the brightest people in the country, that's what I want to do. I want to be a great author. That doesn't happen in every generation and in every society, where you get a whole bunch of bright people say, what I want to be is a great author. What are you talking about? You're going to make no money. You're going to be scrambling your whole life. You probably won't be. It's
nobody writes poetry for money.
It's a remarkable thing. But I think his brothers, they had this powwow when it was time for him to go to college. And the brothers said, well, he's not going to be a lawyer because he stammers all the time now. Like, then he was really constantly stammering at that stage of life. He's not going to be a doctor. He writes well, let him be an author. And they kind of confirmed him. Okay, go off like Benedict Kiley to UCD, become an author down there. And and I think he took that on board, that, okay, my older brothers, who I don't get to live with, but I idolize them, I long for their approval. They've said, oh, you'll be an author, you'll be all right. So you're a stammerer, you'll be an author. I think that would have power for a kid.
Becky, any questions online? No, not so far. Other questions in the room? Maybe I might ask one, Adrian. So, I mean, to what extent would you describe Montague as a political poet? I mean, you kind of give the impression of having politics thrust upon him in 1968, in the crisis. I mean, is he a political poet before that? I mean, does he see himself as having a political message to convey through his writing?
He saw himself as being before that, a very sarcastic and cynical observer of the Free State as a very disappointing society, and not exactly his own. That he's coming from the north, he's inspecting what they're doing down there, and it's a shower of cold piss in the poems. They're very, they don't work that well. They're a bit snide, but there's a sense of alienation there. I'm from the north, and I've also been to Yale and Berkeley and places like that. And this that you are boasting about here is a failure of your expectations from 1922. And they quite alienated. Is that political? Kinda.
No, I'm just finding there's a wonderful letters quoted on page 79. I can't go back even to Ireland for very long. I want to be where things are happening. You can't write about a country that's sleeping peacefully while the whole globe is on fire.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, anyway, yeah, it's that point.
Okay.
Yes. I'm surprised from reading the biography. This question, either sort of this idea that poetry, somebody had a spontaneous idea overnight, put it down, reviewed it perhaps over a week or so, and then that was it. Whereas in fact, what I'm seeing is weeks, days, months, and years of preparation for a particular poem. How common is that among poems? Was my original idea quite wrong, that it was very spontaneous?
I write poetry and I do it the way you said.
Successfully.
You know, I guess no. I mean, they're satisfactory to me, but I wouldn't put them up to anybody else. But I still think it's unusual. But like I know a lot about Yeats and a few other poets that I've examined their manuscripts, and
all the poets that you were referring to whom he gave great attention. How were they similar?
No, like Robert Duncan was. He learned a bit from Robert Duncan, San Francisco poet, and from Gary Snyder, and not from Ginsberg, but they had this saying: first thought, best thought. And Duncan would write his poems in very beautiful handwriting on a page, and then he would never touch them afterwards. And the first thought, best thought. And his idea was, you rewrite stuff, you've destroyed its truth. And John just said, this is nuts. You know, like I think there is something deep in him where, okay, I'm a stammerer, I'm gonna get this right by deliberate improvement of my first efforts and perfection. And I'm gonna shape it into some beautiful speech, really beautiful speech. Couldn't be better. You know, and it's going to sound very natural and normal. And I'm aiming for something, you know, that is actually the way we talk, kind of thing. And it's going to just very simple words, but it's going to be just right. And when he had an ear for, you know, when it clicks and it's done, presto. You know, and he would work on them for a long time before he got to that click. That's it. You know, he had some notion of what he wanted that he was in pursuit of. But he had a lot of patience. But I haven't seen many people where it takes 10 years to finish a lyric poem.
No, Larkin, actually. Painfully slow. But you do see, think about this is very typical. Michael Longley always used to say it's because he was a war baby, he couldn't waste anything. There'll be a fragment from 1969, and that line is not used for years, but it might be used eventually. That's not the same as a poem that's being worked out over those years. But the insane number of drafts is very much early Robert Graves. I think the Troll's Nosegay went through 26 drafts, full drafts. I mean, that's an enormous volume of paper for one poem, you know. But the ideas for poems, people do that, don't they? I've seen various people list ideas, just to see if
Was there any influence from, I can speak and ask embarrassingly, as someone who's halfway through your book, Hopkins? No?
He knew well poetry as a whole, but I don't think Hopkins had anything like the impact on him that it had on, for instance, Seamus Heaney, who was when young, really enlivened by Hopkins. He liked Goldsmith. Wordsworth was his anchor, as Wordsworth was an anchor for Seamus Heaney too. But Wordsworth meant an awful lot to him. He never really. I mean, the words he decided he wanted to use for his memorial are directly from Wordsworth.
Which lines?
Hmm?
Which ones?
I can't remember. Andrew, you don't remember those words, do you? No. It's not a quotation from Wordsworth. It's a rewrite.
Right. Okay.
Almost like Tintern Abbey, but the return to a place that's still feeding you.
Child is father to the man.
Kind of the spots of time passage.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any further questions? Rebecca? No? Okay, so thank you all very much. There are copies of John Montague, The Poet's Life over here. Our friends in No Alibis bookshop have brought some along tonight. So if you'd like to buy a copy, please do so. We might just finish by thanking Adrian for coming and speaking to us, and for Fran for leading the discussion.
Thank you all for coming.